anti-colonial struggles, transnational women's history, and particularly on gendering caste and subaltern history. I now invite Professor Paik to please begin the talk.
Shailaja, you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Papuri, and to the Center for Women's Studies at JNU for inviting me to share my work. And I have been working on Ambedkar and his efforts for women for more than 2 decades now. So it's not just that I'm doing this because Ambedkar is in fashion today and everybody, including scholars, activists, political parties, are appropriating Ambedkar. So I just wanted to, start with that because I am not coming to this, just because of some political and other intellectual context. But this is something that I have done in my first book. And what I'm going to talk today is also, drawing upon my book and books. One is also, that is something that I'm revising right now, the second book, and my articles, and two of them, one, Dr. Ambedkar and the Prostitute, was just published recently in the journal Gender and History. And another one, Dalit Feminist Thought, also came out very recently in the Economic and Political Weekly. So this is the larger work that I am drawing on and that I've worked on for decades. And so my talk is based on these published works. The lives of Dalit women who were at the center of social, political, and historical change in early and mid-19th century India were precarious and fraught with productive paradoxes. Addressing a gathering of Dalit women at the Mahad Conference held from December 5th to 27th, 1927, the anti-caste intellectual and formidable leader of modern India, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, emphasized the qualities Dalit women possessed to generate a new Dalit modernity in late colonial India. And I quote, "You must realize that you possess much virtue, character, and purity like that of a Brahmin woman. Moreover, you have the manodharya, that is the tenacity of mind, kararipana, that is resoluteness, and the dhamak, that is willpower and daring, something that the Brahmin woman lacks. So you should now pledge that you will not live in a degraded, stigmatized condition henceforward," end quote. Attacking the institution of caste as he had done since his famous 1916 essay, Castes in India, Their Mechanisms, Genesis and Development, Ambedkar reconstituted Dalit women as persons and recognized them as humans. Within the sexual economy of caste, Dalit women, unlike Brahmin women, were constituted as neither a woman nor a human. These statuses were reserved for touchables, whom the Indian society, following Brahmanical dictates, has unquestionably fixed at the apex of the Indian culture. Dalit revolt, which gathered force in the 20th century, marked a transition and established a new paradigm in modern India. Building on earlier efforts, Ambedkar was particularly innovative and forceful in articulating and refashioning the Dalit agenda and the caste question after the 1920s. He politicized, democratized, and nationalized the Dalit question and played a creative role in Dalit women's subject formation by emphasizing women's education, reducing gender inequalities, and refashioning Dalit women and the community as a whole. Paradoxically, even as he exalted Dalit women, he also condemned them for particular practices related to dress, cleanliness, and sexual labor. This is what makes Ambedkar and the Dalit woman question a complex and contentious affair. Since the middle of the 19th century, many Dalits and touchables dealt with the woman question and agreed upon new standards of womanhood for the newly modern Indian nation. Since the beginning of the 20th century, Dalit radicals offered an internal critique of the practices of caste, gender, and sexuality, but it was Ambedkar who attempted to civilize, modernize, and legitimize the Dalit self in community on a social, political, cultural, and deeper psychic level in order to make the new Dalit political and to refashion Dalits as fearless citizens of the modern Indian nation. Yet, there were uncertainties, anxieties, and contradictions as Ambedkar exercised his authority. As a result, he created a dichotomy between the asexual and respectable woman on the one hand and the sexual and the unrespectable woman on the other, and rooted respectable sexuality in monogamous marriages, emphasizing family and community values. Considered jewels of the community, civilized, morally upright, and respectable Dalit women were central forces driving social change and constituting Dalit power. I'm focusing on certain themes in my talk today, and my first theme is sex, gender, and caste trouble. In 1916, the 25-year-old Ambedkar argued that the special burden of Dalit women was due to the interlocking technologies of caste, gender, and sexuality. Refuting claims of other scholars of caste, he underscored the significance of endogamy, that is, the closed-door system of marriage rooted in numerical equality between the sexes, as the fundamental characteristic or essence of caste, as he mentioned. And I quote Ambedkar here, he argued that endogamy is the key to the mystery of the caste system. It is only through the maintenance of inequality between the sexes that the necessary endogamy of the group can be kept intact, end quote. By initiating this intellectual inquiry in 1916, Ambedkar articulated a gendered and sexual analysis of caste through the mechanism of endogamy in India. Most importantly, in doing so, he examined what I call a sex, gender, and caste complex. The sex, gender, caste complex deployed women's biological sex and their social roles as wives and mothers to produce and reproduce the economy of caste. As such, this complex regulated women's sexuality, social mobility, and economic resources, safeguarding the privilege and power of the Brahmin caste, and especially Brahmin men. The importance of endogamy as a structuring principle of the sex, gender, caste complex as the mechanism for caste served to address dominant caste fears of caste miscegenation. And just for the audience, as I said, I have already explained this in details in my article that is published, which is entitled Ambedkar and the Prostitute in the journal Gender and History. So please look it up for further details. Endogamy was achieved mainly through the regulation and control of women's sexuality, such that caste enclosed and maintained not only the purity of blood, the biology, but also purity of being, that is the psychosociology. Women's sexual subordination was institutionalized by ancient male lawgivers as well as by kinship, and increasingly in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the state. Most significantly, Ambedkar exposed the strong ties between sexuality and sociality. Brahmanical patriarchy and gender codes closely guarded and highly valued the sexuality of Brahmin surplus women. And I quote, Sati, enforced widowhood, and girl marriage are customs that were primarily intended to solve the problem of the surplus man and woman in a caste and to maintain endogamy, end quote, by preventing them from transgressing the boundaries of caste. Strict endogamy could not be preserved without these customs. Ambedkar also analyzed ancient literature to put forth a passionate critique of the lower position of Shudras as well as that of Hindu women. Moreover, it was not merely a coincidence that Ambedkar wrote two essays, almost substituting women for Shudras. So the two essays that he wrote were Shudras and the Counter-Revolution and Women and the Counter-Revolution. In his Rise and Fall of the Hindu Woman, Ambedkar argued, and I quote, Brahmanism denied women the right to acquire knowledge, which was the birthright of every human being. It was an insult because after denying her opportunity to acquire knowledge, she was declared to be as unclean, as untruth for want of knowledge. And unlike men, she was also denied the right to realize her spiritual potential. End quote. Thus, Ambedkar examined educational, social, and gender discrimination, that the ongoing degradation of Shudras, Ati-Shudras, and all women was propelled by some influential Brahmin men. He thus established connections between the role of gender and Brahmin castes, intellectual monopoly, which were predicated on their selective knowledge dissemination. Only gradually, and I quote, with the permanence of the monogamous marriage arrangement, could Brahmin men command Brahmin women's compliance with their goal. By sharing some of the knowledge privilege with touchable women, Brahmin men thus privileged consenting women subjects who in turn emphasized Brahmin exclusivity. To fight the organic connection between caste and sex inequality and the closing of certain groups against others, many touchable and Dalit radicals, including Ambedkar, underscored intercaste or mixed marriages. However, it was Ambedkar who forcefully argued, and I quote, the real remedy for breaking caste is intermarriage. Nothing else will serve as a solvent of caste, end quote. The political strategy of intercaste marriages would annihilate caste distinctions, weaken the identity of the community, and enable women to secure their sexual rights. Working with these political practices, some women married outside their caste. Nevertheless, deploying his weapons of logic and reason, Ambedkar revealed the crevices in Manu's law of divorce. And I quote, many Hindus also thought of Manu marriage as a sacrament and therefore did not allow divorce. This, of course, is far from the truth. His law against divorce had a very different motive. It was not to tie up a man to a woman, but it was to tie up the woman to a man and leave the man free, end quote. Ambedkar thus articulated a powerful critique of Brahmanical patriarchy and the sanctity of Hindu marriage, which could not be violated by divorce. Moreover, he valued a woman's individual choice and construed marriage as a social contract, an agreement between women and men that could be broken at will, a radical notion at that time. Certainly, a new epoch of Dalit womanhood was truly dawning. And here I also want to emphasize that it is not just Dalit womanhood that Ambedkar is, trying to make efforts for, but he's also arguing, about how Brahmin women were actually oppressed by the sex, caste, and gender complex, as I call it. So what could Ambedkar do to forge a new ideal and respectable womanhood? Ambedkar creatively deployed feminist technologies to forge a new and ideal womanhood in colonial Western India. Respectful Dalit womanhood was predicated on seeking education and building self-respect, self-reliance, and manuski, that is human dignity, in contrast with the modern but modest and mellow and dependent woman constructed by the touchables. Women's education was at the core of his social reform, and Ambedkar stressed the significance of knowledge and understanding for both boys and girls. He argued, and I quote, "Knowledge and learning are not for men alone. They are essential for women too." So if you want progress for future generation, education of girls is very important, end quote. Ambedkar emphasized women's cultivation of their intellect and self-development for personal freedom. Sudharna, that is improvement and progress, became a metaphor for reform, and Ambedkar argued that without education and improvement, women would not be able to provide an intelligent training to their children. Continuing the efforts of earlier Dalit radicals, Ambedkar intimately connected the private and public realms of Dalit women. As a result, many Dalits approached educational opportunity from a profound sense of shared responsibility. These processes led to many possibilities because education was a marker of respectable status and dignity, especially important to Dalit women. Ambedkar also forged a masculine Dalit womanhood, as I call it. In contrast to Brahmin patriarchal prescriptions of genteel behavior as part of the discourse of an idealized Brahmin femininity, Ambedkar constructed what I call a masculine Dalit womanhood. In this construction, Ambedkar and other Dalit radicals emphasized Dalit women's fortitude and independence, which stood in stark contrast to the touchable construction of women as dependent and fickle. Ambedkar championed women's equality with men and their supposedly masculine qualities of mental tenacity, resoluteness, that is nishchay and kararipana, and willpower and daring, that is dhadadi and dhamak, highlighting these qualities, for instance, in his address to the gathering of Dalit women at the Mahad Conference in December 1927. While touchables conceived of women as naturally destructive, deceptive, and thus perceived women's agency as a negative social force, Ambedkar constructed Dalit women as agents of a positive social change, both for themselves and the Dalit community. Many touchables and British citizens commonly viewed Dalits with contempt. Ambedkar was keenly aware of the ways these ruling classes had essentialized and oppressed both Dalits on the basis of caste and women. According to ideas of gender and sexuality, they tended to regard Dalit men as submissive, fatalistic, and of low intellect, and Dalit women as vulgar and of loose morals. To counter this dominant discourse, Dalit radicals sought to create a more assertive and moral persona for members of the Dalit community, which in the case of women meant adopting what were considered more masculine attributes: willpower, daring, confidence. These, it was held, would further their quest for rights, their sense of self, and their dignity. Ambedkar appealed to Dalit women as mothers of an oppressed class of men, and I quote, "You gave birth to us, and we are treated worse than animals," end quote. He therefore challenged Dalit women to either stop reproducing children or fight the blot of untouchability born of them. He continued, and I argue, and I quote, "Other people can fetch respectable jobs in courts and offices, but the sons born of your wombs are held in immense contempt. What is the difference between us and the children born of the Kayasth and other caste Hindu women? Why are Dalits subjected to an inferior position, denied educational and job opportunities, and simple rights to humanity? You must think about this," end quote. Ambedkar thus brought out the contradiction in the status of women belonging to different castes and also commented on the children they bore. Because he believed that Dalit women and children should enjoy equal human rights and have the self-confidence to build robust Dalit futures and eventually Dalit power. As a result, he provoked Dalit women to question touchable women's privilege and claims to purity, in contrast to their curse of impurity. Yet, Dalit women in Ambedkar's thinking were paradoxically worthy of blame for their ongoing oppression, especially if they did not heed his advice to enact these masculine qualities in the service of the Dalit community as a whole. Consequently, Ambedkar wanted women and men to become more masculine, that is, more self-conscious and self-confident, in order to make their own destiny in a daring and determined manner. So once again, I want to underline that we need this masculinity is not about just growing muscular men, or women are not here talking about how they can just function more like men, but ideas of self-consciousness and self-confidence and will and daring, these are the supposed ideas that were supposedly looked upon as masculine in those times. As a result, he argued that both men and women were capable of daring and self-respect, though these qualities were masculine in nature. Ambedkar exhorted women to rethink their attitudes towards education, motherhood, public roles, and employment. He encouraged them to find a new voice through women's conferences and active involvement in protests. In all, he sought to initiate a radical change in their historical circumstances and voice produced in the crucible of domestic and public politics. By looking upon women as equal partners in the fight for justice, Ambedkar opened significant spaces for Dalit women's sustained political commitment. He encouraged women to participate in the conferences that he launched to fight for common civic rights for Dalits, such as those to gain access to public temples, streets, and water tanks. For example, more than 10,000 Dalit women and men attended the All India Conference of the Boycotted, held in Nagpur from May 30th to June 1st, 1920. The conference passed significant resolutions on education, the consumption of alcohol and carrion, and political representation. During his speech at the 1927 Mahad Conference Women's Meeting, Ambedkar specifically placed the burden of social responsibility and of ending untouchability on Dalit women. He argued, and I quote, "The problems of annihilation of caste and everyday life must be tackled by women and men together. If men alone undertake this work, I have no doubt that they will take a longer time to complete it. If women, however, take this up, I believe that compared to men, women would do a better job and will soon succeed. Therefore, you must attend the conferences and help men in their work. To tell the truth, the task of removing untouchability belongs not to men, but to you women," end quote. Thus, Ambedkar pulled respectable women into the political public sphere. But at the same time, he expressed his cultural and gendered anxiety, as he also expressed his authority. On the one hand, he made the project of ending untouchability the responsibility of both women and men, and thus asserted gender equity and companionship, arguing that just as men have decided to work for the community uplift, so should you. On the other hand, by arguing that the task of removing untouchability belonged to women, he seemed to undercut men by suggesting the superior moral and physical strength of women. This declaration of women's advantage at one level echoes the move of touchable nationalists, including Gandhi, to defining and mobilizing, in this case, the bodies and actions of women, as well as discourse of femininity in terms of their service to the radical Dalit agenda. Gandhi's patronizing, paternalistic, and elite agenda only served to reinforce Dalit dependence on touchables and rarely included Dalit women or commented on the latter's agency and action. In contrast, Ambedkar identified the woman as the helpmeet of man, thus making her supplementary to man's primary political task and reiterating traditional gender discourse. Yet, this suggests a complicated and differential positioning of women within Dalit modernity. Although on the surface it seems that Ambedkar accepted certain gendered duties, but at the same time, he also challenged patriarchy to enhance women's autonomy. He argued, and I quote, "She, that is a woman, the woman should underscore equality in her relationship and refuse forcefully to act like a slave. If you act on this advice, you will attain high respect and honor." End quote. Ambedkar thus underscored women's individuated subjectivity, freedom, and equality with men. His commitment to women, man, equality also found an important place in the 22 vows he would give to neo-Buddhists during the Dhammadiksha, that is the conversion to Buddhism ceremony on October 14, 1956. Inspired and transformed by these Ambedkarite winds of change, as articulated by the feminist Bebitai Kamble, many women, including Chandrika Bai Ramteke, Jai Bai Chaudhary, Sulochana Bai Dongre, Lakshmi Bai Naik, the sisters Sita Bai Ramabai and Gita Bai Gaikwad, among others, were fearless leaders agitating and organizing in the Samta Mahila Sainik Dal, that is the All India Dalit, in the Samta Mahila Sainik Dal, the All India Dalit Mahila Congress, the All India Scheduled Caste Federation, and the Bahishkrit Hitkarni Sabha. More than 500 women marched like disciplined soldiers, for example, at the start of the Nashik Satyagraha of 1930. As a result, as Parbatabai Meshram has argued, women gained knowledge of the outside world. They became aware of injustice, oppression, and insult, and a sense of identity awakened in them. Consequently, Bebitai Kamble asserted the success of Bhimavara. And I quote, "Ambedkar's movement led to the creation of enthusiasm and activity, courage, determinacy, and positivity, as gradually one idea formed and sprouted forth many." End quote. These practices were immensely relevant to improving Dalit women's dignity, which was tightly bound to the pride of the large Dalit community. The process, however, was both enabling and constraining at the same time. Ambedkar also forged an intimate body politics to remake Dalit women's emotional and corporeal selves. New respectable Dalit women repossessed their bodies and created new voices for themselves. A significant task for Ambedkar was the radical rejection of certain markers of untouchability associated with clothing, jewelry, naming, and housing, which were all strictly policed by touchables. He emphasized the need for women to change their dress, for example. And I quote, "You should abandon all old and filthy customs and rituals that provide recognizable evidence of untouchability. Certainly, untouchables do not possess a stamp of their untouchable status on their foreheads, but untouchables can be immediately identified due to their customs. Hence, you should abandon all such markers. Your style of draping sari is one such evidence. You should destroy it. You should make it a habit to drape saris like the higher caste one. Similarly, the many necklaces and silver and tin bangles are also a mark of identification. Clothes reflect a more elegant appearance compared to jewelry, and hence you should spend on good clothing. Also, pay attention to cleanliness. Change your style of draping the sari before you go home. End quote. To Ambedkar, in order to modernize Dalits, both Dalit women and men had to annihilate minor cultural distinctions that indicated their caste status. As a result, physical experience of intentionally donning clean dress and fewer pieces of jewelry emerged as powerful practices of presenting Dalit women's transformed personhood, dignity, morality, and virtue. By giving up caste-specific stigmatized dressing styles and heavy jewelry, Dalit women asserted themselves against both Brahmanical caste and gender codes, as well as intercaste patriarchies. Dalits performed a higher status and individual and collective dignity and dispositions through their robust body politics, as I call it. And they formed an embodied struggle that constituted a rebellion against the hierarchy of dress that produced distinctions between women of various castes. The politics of naming, of draping a full sari, of wearing footwear, of being clean, and of not being submissive in the presence of touchables was significant for Dalit self-respect, the transformation of their identity, and for displaying modernity. By appropriating high caste sari draping, Dalit women were not merely Sanskritizing or reinforcing touchable norms of proper femininity. Rather, they were contesting touchable status as the holders of value. Moreover, they were disidentifying a touchable sari draping style. And this was a political act through which Dalits not only resisted the dominant ideology, but also embodied a disempowered politics or positionality that had been rendered unthinkable by the dominant culture. Through their sartorial practices, Dalit women embodied their resistance, destabilizing and transforming dominant norms for their own political purposes. In 1942, Ambedkar recorded a radical change in dress and speech of about 20 to 25,000 Dalit women present at the All India Depressed Classes Conference in Nagpur. Nevertheless, these processes were tenuous, and moreover, they were subject to a double bind. Dalit women's subjection was simultaneously produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation and modernity was sought. I want to now quickly move on to Ambedkar and the prostitute question. And as you know, in interest of time, I have to, I can only touch upon this, but maybe in some other talk, I can spend more time, but you can find this article that has been published in the journal Gender and History. The Dalit struggle for self-respect, community uplift, and liberation were tightly tied to female sexual restraint, appropriate behavior, ideal conjugality, and the construction of a modest and moral Dalit womanhood. As I demonstrated earlier, Ambedkar himself had analyzed the sexual question, the question of surplus women and endogamy, as the mechanism for caste, which was the most acute and agonizing aspect of the whole economy of caste. Ambedkar was less concerned with the issue of prostitution in terms of Dalit prostitutes than he was with the ritualized rape of Dalit women by men of different religions, and especially touchable men. Touchable men enjoyed this privilege without having to give up their caste status, as they would be in the case of intercaste marriage. But in constituting prostitution as a ritualized rape, as a sign of humiliation, for respectable and upwardly mobile Dalits, and thus an issue of Dalit humanity and modernity, Ambedkar placed the onus of reform on the Dalit prostitute. However, elite feminist scholars who have touched upon this issue in passing have focused more on patriarchy rather than the particular constitution of Dalit women's subjectivity. Ambedkar argued, and I quote, "In Mumbai today, if the Mahar community must walk with heads hung, it is when they walk through your Kamatipura, that is a red light district. Every Mahar feels frustrated when he witnesses how their sisters allow the rest of the Samaj to ridicule and shame them." End quote. Ambedkar blamed the prostitute for the oppression of Dalits. She became an object of shame and hate for enticing men and inviting exploitation of her own body. He expressed his anxieties and held the prostitute responsible for the larger social ridiculing of Dalit men and the Dalit community. Fighting against both caste stigma and the implications of the prescribed endogamous sexuality of caste were important to radically recuperate Dalit humanity, dignity, and to build fraternal bonds inside the Dalit community in order to march towards equality, justice, and liberty. As a result, Ambedkar warned the prostitute women. And I quote, Ambedkar argued, we are converting to get out of these durgandhite, that is stinking circumstances. If you want to join us, that is join with your caste community, then the first step is for you to absolutely abandon your stinking lifestyle. If you want to join us, you have to purify your body, language, and mind. Only after you have cleansed yourself with this purity can you come along with us, or else you cannot join us in our movement. End quote. To Ambedkar, prostitutes emerged as interior illicit frontiers against which the respectable Dalit Samaj had to defend itself. Yet, this purity is not the touchable or the Gandhian paradigm of pure body and mind constructed in the abstract. Ambedkar borrowed certain touchable purity tropes, but deployed them in pursuit of different agendas: to annihilate caste, to carve out a Dalit community, and to forge equality, justice, and Dalit power. To him, a robust moral mind and body were fundamental for a Dalit ethics and politics of care. For example, by abandoning caste-specific occupations and donning white clothes for dharmantar, Dalits asserted their respectable and clean selves. Nevertheless, Ambedkar created distinct boundaries between moral and immoral, good and bad, respectable and unrespectable, and us and them within the Mahar community. Ambedkar also troublingly warned prostitutes, and I quote, "If you continue living like this, being a blot on the Mahar community, I am warning you that I will prepare thousands of young volunteers to uproot you from Kamatipura." End quote. Ambedkar deployed righteous force as a positive energy in pursuit of two valuable outcomes: protecting the life and liberty of prostitutes and forging a liberated Dalit self for the future. These were the tensions as the prostitute troubled the self and community in making. Like many touchable elites, Ambedkar also sought to resolve the problem of the prostitute within traditional marriage and kinship structures. Following him, many women decided to break with their stigmatized past, protest caste and religion-based prostitution, and converted to Buddhism. Yet, not every Dalit woman agreed with Ambedkar's path to liberation. They were many women were not ready to abandon their degrading caste labor because although it was stigmatizing, some occupations, including sanitation labor, provided the means of everyday survival as well as the value and wealth to many Dalits. Many women thus made different and difficult choices within the constraints of caste and class. Many so-called dishonorable women, including Jogtis and the Tamasha women I am writing about, continued work in and earn from practices that were stigmatized as corrupt in order to support themselves and their families. And certainly kinship can be formed outside marriage, and marriage can also produce women's subordination. Yet I argue that Ambedkar deployed the productive alliance of marriage, sexuality, and family to build Dalit power. Such a marriage and family strategy was significant for improving Dalit women's izzat in the community and the larger society. Consequently, Ambedkar emphasized, and I quote, that monogamous marriage, conjugality, and family structures are appropriate, end quote. Propriety and virtue were especially important to Dalit women who had been denied both humanity and womanhood. Ambedkar also, and this is my last point, and I will move on very quickly, as we know, played an instrumental role in the drafting of the Hindu Code Bill, which was deliberated upon from 1947 to 1951. And as he argued, and I quote, to leave inequality between class and class, between sex and sex, which is the soul of Hindu society, untouched, and to go on passing legislation in relation to economic problems is to make a farce of a new constitution and to build a palace of dung heap. This is the significance I attach to the Hindu code, end quote. Thus, Ambedkar continued to attack the social roots of the caste complex that was most significant to him. The Hindu code opened the possibility of mixed caste marriages and allowed women the right to divorce, thus construing marriage as a social contract. The right to sexuality and the right to inheritance thus emerged as the two sides of the same coin. Touchables bitterly opposed the controversial bill. Although the Hindu code was empowering to many women, many touchable women opposed it. Even Hindu sadhus laid siege to the parliament to challenge Ambedkar. Nevertheless, Dalit women staunchly supported Ambedkar's efforts to pass the Hindu code, which attacked caste-based patriarchies and aimed to reform laws on marriage, property, and divorce, and to empower all Indian women. And I underline, the code was to empower all Indian women, irrespective of caste, class, and religion. In conclusion, to Ambedkar, the Dalit woman question was deeply rooted in the radical recuperation of morality and humanity and the remaking of Dalit women and men, as well as of the Dalit community. So I revealed some delicate tensions, but at the same time, I focused on how Ambedkar provided transformative possibilities to women to achieve full status as a woman and a human in the economy of caste. Nevertheless, there was a double bind. Dalit women's subjection was simultaneously produced and restrained by the very structures of power through which emancipation was sought. Radical men's anxieties and contradictions affected many Dalit women, yet women have continued to carve out spaces, even if small, for themselves. They continue to negotiate to maximize their power and freedom. Dalit women lived within contingent contradictions. The oppressed and indecent sexual conditions of stigmatized women presented further predicaments within Dalit modernity, and tensions emerged. Ambedkar was critically concerned with the ritualized rape of Dalit women by the exercise of caste power by men of different religions and especially touchables. Hence, he consistently worked to raise their status. Dalit political actions thus teach us to seriously consider the household, familial relationships, and their complex engagement with larger historical, social, and political concerns of caste, race, community, and nation. Ambedkar's political choices were thus not arbitrary, but determined by his own social experience, connections with Dalit community, and most importantly, his commitment and consistency, which are remarkable in the view of the extreme complexity. And indeed, the anchoring of feminist solidarity requires such common responsibility, common interests, and interconnectedness among women, men, inside the family, and among different communities. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you so much, Shailaja, for this amazing talk. You have situated Ambedkar for us within a very complex history, I think within terms which are not simplistic, and in terms of questions, in terms of Dalit women's subjectivity, you complicate that understanding beyond, as you say in your work, beyond this whole paradigm of victim and heroine, and you situate it within a complex history. What you've told us in terms of the sex, gender, caste complex is extremely important in terms of how we understand this. And in terms of understanding Ambedkar in this larger context of the women's question, which broadens up in terms of larger questions in terms of feminist theory, and in terms of your own contribution in terms of Dalit feminist thought. Thank you so much. I'm sure we have a lot of questions. If I could ask the audience to type in their questions in the chat box. And if you would like to speak, you could just raise your hand. There is an icon at the bottom of your screen. You could indicate that in terms of if you want to ask your question in person. Otherwise, you can just type in your questions in the chat box. Okay, the first question over here is from Sai Thakur. She says, I would like to ask, why do you think Ambedkar considered family so important?
So, Papuri, do you want me to take just one question at a time? Or
yeah, go ahead.
Fine?
Or
okay.
We can ask for more questions, but I think people are just warming up in terms of asking questions. So if you could respond to that.
That's fine. Yes. Yes, Sai, thank you for the question. So the history of caste and the functioning of the mechanisms of caste basically do not allow for Dalits to have these strong bonds inside the family. So familial bonds and kinship bonds are something that are constantly broken. So Dalits have not had the luxury to enjoy bonds of familial relationships. And that is the reason family is very important to Ambedkar.
Papuri, you're on mute, like.
Yeah. All right. So yeah. So thanks, Navanita. So Sai has another question. I think we'll come back to her, but there's another question by Hafsa Rahman. Ambedkar's condemnation of prostitute women, how do we see it in today's time? Was his views shaped by history?
Yes, certainly, and that is why, I mean, as a historian, that is why, as I presented throughout this talk, Ambedkar is very much talking in the context of his own historical, social, political, and ideological context. And so we should certainly, pay good attention to what he's doing. And when he's speaking with the so-called stigmatized, blotted women of Kamatipura in 1936.
Okay.
And
So
so,
we
when we
have,
think about the prostitute, sorry, just thinking about the prostitute question in the 21st century and from the lens of the 21st century is not going to be helpful. We need to understand the historical context as well as I very clearly underline in my talk, the content and the contradictions through which Ambedkar is trying to make these choices.
okay. So we have three raised hands. So first Sai Thakur, then Umakant, and then Vidushi can go ahead with their questions. Sai, if you could first
Yeah,
start.
yeah. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Shailaja, for that very interesting talk. I just, and this to follow up with the same question, one thing which I wanted to point out was that, it's the fact that you mentioned that, family life or the close ties of family were not available for, Dalit women. What I think is very significant that Angela Davis also talks about Black women in a very similar fashion. And also Phule himself, talks about, a family which is, family as an important institution in his khandas. So I think there seems to be some, kind of a connection about, why family, especially because, feminists have always criticized family as a site of exploitation. So it's very significant, and I think there is a need to explore that. I just wanted to know the references for this. You quoted Ambedkar speaking or discussing about family. So can you specify the books or the volume from where you took this? I was interested to know that. So where
Yeah,
did
certainly, Sai. And first, let me go back to that question of the family. And that is exactly the reason why I am arguing and showing what Ambedkar had to say about the family and why the family is so important for Dalits. And this is a challenge to how elite feminists have portrayed the family as oppressive. So that is the point that I'm certainly making. For volumes, page numbers, please go to my article on Ambedkar and the prostitute, and you will find it there. I cannot, sift through my pages
okay,
all over here
okay,
again
okay,
and
fine,
point out
fine,
the page numbers.
fine, fine,
Yes,
fine. Thank
sure.
you.
Okay, Umakant, you can go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Shailaja ji. It was really enlightening. But I would like to know, as during your presentation, you also mentioned that Ambedkar challenged the dominant caste practices as far as securing better future for women in general and Dalit women in particular. But how much support he was getting from the non-Dalit women, or for that matter, the non-Dalit society at large? I'm really curious to know about it.
Yeah, so this is something that I have worked in detail, in my first book. So I
Okay.
would invite you to look up my book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India, where I have
Good.
an entire chapter of 35 pages
Oh.
devoted to to what touchable women were doing. So
Yeah.
they were making some attempts, but at the same time, we clearly see that they were also marginalizing Dalit women, and in terms of discrimination as well as not really taking up Dalit women's agendas, because they wanted to be respectable and honorable in the society. So if they were going to align with Dalit women, they might lose some of this. So we see these tensions. So as I said, I have an entire chapter devoted to this. And we also see that there is not much conversation between them and Ambedkar, to that matter. So these are the problems. Yeah.
Yeah, that's why I feel that, like, on Hindu Code Bill, he could not get support from Congress women leaders. I mean,
Correct.
except from Nehru, nobody was supporting him.
Right.
And that is why I think he has to resign from the cabinet. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Vidushi, you can go ahead.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am, for your lecture. We've been discussing the articles written by you in our classes, so it's a pleasure to hear you, ma'am. When we read your pieces, there's a particular usage that you make of technologies. Like we usually hear, no, caste practices, caste as an aspect, but you make the reference in terms of technologies, and you make a particular usage of Foucault drawing from him. and talking about technologies of self. So while we try to decipher that through our discussion, I would like you to speak about a bit about why do you pick on that particular usage of caste-based technologies and technologies of self when you specifically that runs as a thread across your work that we have read and come upon. And there's a second question that we had, like when we were recently discussing your work, we realized that there is a particular way that you write, which is that you always locate yourself very clearly as part of the community that you're speaking it from, which I think as scholars, because when we talk about ethical spaces that we speak from, politics of location, we are always asked to be wary of the fact that, you know, you cannot speak for somebody. I mean, in the sense that just don't be appropriate someone's voice and so on and so forth. Like you always, you don't know where do you. It's a very so. I don't know if I'm coming across. I'm able to put it across well, but there's a particular way that you situate yourself in your articles, which is very interesting, and it's something which tells us about your political ideals that you hold close. So I wanted to you to talk a bit about that way of talking into locating yourselves in your articles when you write them. So why that particular point position of writing? So yeah, just that.
Yeah, thank you, Vidushi, for those two questions. So technology, yes, certainly coming from Foucault, but just drawing upon as to how, if we are using that to understand the structures of caste and gender and sexuality. So that is the main purpose, to see as to how caste has to understand the mechanism of caste and gender and sexuality, and the way it has shaped the broader structures as well as certain communities. So that is the reason I think that it is helpful. It helps us in understanding how things play on the ground, the grand schemes, as well as what Dalits are doing to fight this structure, and also in the process to transform themselves. That is why the technology of the self, I think, is very helpful in understanding how Dalits were thinking about self-respect and dignity, about speaking for themselves. So that concept of technology of the self is, I feel, is helpful in understanding those processes, of modernity. The second question of locating myself. So yes, as even in my talk today, as I mentioned about the self in the community, and that is how I also position myself in my work. And we have moved a long way because from objective scholarship to understanding how scholars are implicated in their works. And so this is what I try to do in my scholarship, because I conduct a lot of interviews, so I do a lot of field work, and so these experiences have taught me that I'm so much a part of an outsider, but also an insider at the same time. So we need to move beyond these binaries, and I think that these are the new avenues and the ways I think I would like to position myself. I mean, everybody is free to take their own decisions, but this is what I think is more fruitful, productive, and a robust scholarship for me.
Thank you so much. So we will move on to some of the questions in the chat box. Okay. Okay, so I'll read out a few questions, Shailaja. Maybe you can maybe take them together if you want, or do you want me to go one by one?
It's okay. I think there are a lot of them, so I'm just trying to see
okay.
what.
Yeah. So I can read it out so you can see how you want to respond. So the first question, another question is by Sandeep Tanwar. How would you differentiate Gandhi's view on women from Ambedkar? I think you briefly touched upon this. Then there's a question by Anand C. Do we have progressed a lot in the class distinction? We still stand behind for much development. So is it good to emphasize more on the class issue when we are really trying to move ahead? Is the progression of literature emphasizing more on this? Then there's a question by Megha. Well, family is the root cause of oppression, according to feminists. So why do you think family as an institution is important? I think you've already answered this question. There's another question by Surya Jyoti Bishnoi. Yes, Ambedkar and his arguments on annihilation of caste have always been of interest to me. I want to ask what mindset did he make to connect intercaste marriage with caste mitigation? Can you please highlight in terms of historical context? Then there's a question by Ekta Bakshi. Thank you so much, Professor Paik. So far, whenever the domestic is taught in relation with the concepts of nation, citizenship, etc. in India, the protagonist is still the Savarna women. How does making the Dalit women, I think the center, you mean, right, Ekta? How does making the Dalit women at the center of analysis change our understanding of this relationship? Do you want me to stop and you can take you?
It's a lot. I will try my best. So maybe with Ekta's question. So how can we think about the domestic if we center Dalit women? So I think that is where I think once again, thinking about the family that Ambedkar is pushing us to think of, and this is departing from from elite feminist frameworks and Savarna feminist practices. So thinking about how men inside the family could actually support women. And I think this is why, just going back to Ambedkar when he is telling us that women and men are partners in the family, and that they should work together, and that women should take men to task if they do not agree with them. So I think this is an important lesson that we can learn, and once again drawing from my talk today. So family is not necessarily an agent of oppression at all times, and this is what Ambedkar is teaching us. So I think this answers once again, goes back to what Sai was talking about, and my answer to Sai and to Ekta here. Then the second one on intercaste marriage, and so many reformers talk about intercaste marriage in the early 20th century. But as I made it very clear in my talk today, it was Ambedkar who forcefully argued that intercaste marriage would actually annihilate caste. So just once again, this was his way of tackling the caste question. Regarding Gandhi and Ambedkar and women, well, there is a lot of work on Gandhi, so please go look at it, look at that. There is also work on Gandhi and women, and I think Sujata Patel recently revisited her work on Gandhi and women. So please take a look. This talk and my work focuses on Ambedkar and women. So, I don't want to get into too many details about Gandhi, Ambedkar, and women. Maybe that's a topic for another talk. But just once again, to go back to my talk, I presented as to how Ambedkar's ideas on prostitute women differed from Gandhi's, or Ambedkar's ideas on women themselves as masculine, daring, independent, self-reliant Dalit women. This itself, is very much in contrast to the Gandhian womanhood. All right. So I can,
So,
yeah, I'm just trying to
yeah,
scroll.
so Shainal wanted to ask you in person. So Shainal, go ahead and ask your question. She has a raise hand.
Okay.
Thank you, Papori ma'am. It's really nice to see you again after joining your course in JNU. Jai Bhim, everyone. So this is me, Shanal, and I'm a young research scholar at IIT Delhi. My research is also on re-theorizing Dalit, the question of Dalit feminism, and myself being a Dalit woman, so reading and writing about Dalit women, I think. Shailaja ma'am's work becomes very, very prominent and important for me over the years whenever I've read scholarship on the question of Dalit women. You know, the kind of work I read, did not emphasize much on Ambedkar and what Ambedkar was talking about. And when I actually read some of ma'am's article, the first one, The Bioscope of Our Lives, so who is our ally, right? So it explored a very new vantage point of how to really understand the whole question on feminism in relation to Dalit women, right? So my question was just that, it's more centered on your research, like when you go out on the field and when you interview Dalit women and you are a person who's an insider, so how do you articulate your own understanding of their lives? How do you place your lived experience in between? Because I'm sure there are tensions within the field itself. So it's more centered on the research aspect also, and also on how do you conceptualize and come to understand new frameworks through which you can understand the Dalit woman's question, like what Dr. Ambedkar has talked about and his thought. I'm sure, like women who believe in him and read about him, we have already come across all this. But I'm sure the new research demands new areas to be explored. So, what all new areas can we really think about when it comes to like love and friendships? How caste and desire itself is also mediated by caste, right? Caste as a structure. So, on those aspects, how can we engage with new areas within this whole research and take really this discourse forward? So that is all I wanted to ask.
Yeah,
Thank you so much, Ellen.
thank you, Shen. That's a lot. But so just very quickly to point out. So, for example, uh, my article on Dr. Ambedkar and the prostitute. I mean, that itself is a way to illuminate the tensions in the community. I mean, I've done this earlier also, but I think that, really takes us to the heart of the dissensions in the Dalit community. And that is one way of doing new research and, providing new ways of thinking about the content and the context and what Dalit radicals were trying to do. And at the same time, we see that these radical agendas were also, punctured by some other forces. So what are these forces? So this is what I am trying to do through my scholarship. So I think, just I would suggest just, looking up these pieces and seeing how I am trying to push against conventional feminist frameworks and conventional paradigms, I think is a way for us, to learn what we could do. The second is, and this is most important for scholars of feminist women's history and Dalit studies, and people who work on marginalized communities, is the vernacular. So in my entire scholarship for over more than 2 decades, I have drawn immensely upon Marathi vernacular literature. And I think the vernacular really, provides me new ways to think about these questions, which are absolutely ignored, underread, unexamined in the limited, narrow English sources that most scholars work with. So I think that is another avenue, and we are seeing much work recently with these materials. So I would suggest working on those lines.
Okay, so we have a few more questions. All right. So Mugunthan R asks, why does Ambedkar speak of Dalit women in terms of practices of modesty? I hope I got your question right. There's a question by Deepa Veluyuthan. Where can we find the recording of this talk? Okay, we will put this up in a week or so on the Center for Women's Studies YouTube page, right? Navanita and our students. Yeah. Okay. Dr. Umakant has another question. How do you see the status of Dalit women's movement today from Ambedkar's perspective? Hafsa Rahman has another question. In Gandhi's view, can we track an evolution of his thoughts on caste system? Is there such a track in Ambedkar's way of work or thought? I think Shailaja has already said that the talk is about Ambedkar and not Gandhi at this point. Okay. So Nishta Desai says, thank you. Rennie Thomas has a question. Thanks very much, Shailaja, for this very engaging lecture. I was thinking about the possibility of reading Ambedkar and Periyar together on the women question. Can we think of the shared questions, concerns, and thinking they had in their articulation, especially on dignity, modernity, and freedom? Thanks again. Kavya Thalapal, is there a possibility of Ambedkar being influenced somehow by Sri Narayana Guru? Shruti Uke has a question. I am very happy to receive your analysis on caste and patriarchy, but Ambedkar talked that intercaste marriages are temporary solution for caste annihilation. Would you please reflect on that? Deepak Ojha, how do you look at intersectionality among Dalit women, such as class and its role in Dalit womanhood? Dr. San B, intercaste marriage or intervarna marriage, what will make a bigger impact on the annihilation of caste system? Can you please enlighten on this? So, okay, that's it. I think I'll stop here. So there's a lot of question on intercaste.
Yeah, I'm seeing, yes, that is something that has really sparked a lot of interest. I mean, I can also see politically, in our political context, today, so where it is going. So Ambedkar suggested his ideas and his, some resolution, some ways in which caste could be annihilated, right? And we still are, so he presented, he talked about these ideas 80 years ago, but even in the 21st century, 2021, we are seeing that intercaste marriage is still such a big problem. So we are still not able to grapple with the idea of intercaste and intervarna marriage. So there's such a challenge. So I think, just I want to just highlight that it is such a complex and problematic affair to do this, and we are not able to really resolve it. But this is just thinking about it, that is one way to resolve it. And okay, I'm going to move on. Just pick a few. There are a lot of questions. I am sorry, I will not be able to do justice to each and every one, but I'm trying my best. So I have a question here. Preeti is asking me on the Dalit humanist complex that I have talked about. So here I am bringing together once again, how Dalit women have not been considered human and not been considered woman, and how even the framework of feminism is slightly, is constrained to understand Dalit women's problems. So that is how I constructed that complex to understand Dalit womanhood. The other one, intersectionality. This is Deepak, intersectionality among Dalit women and class. So that is the thing. So clearly we see that there are dissensions in terms of class in the Dalit community, right? And that is why when questions of Dalit women who are looked upon as disreputable and unhonorable by Dalit middle classes, what happens to their experiences, their livelihood, how can we think about them? So this is what is really something that I'm doing in my Ambedkar and the Prostitute article. And this is what I am working on in my second book right now. But these are some of the issues that, this again, avenues for future scholarship. Then, is there a possibility of Ambedkar Periyar? Yes, certainly, Rennie. And this is something that calls for more work. So if you are thinking about it, if somebody can, work on these wonderful connected and, ideologies and comparative, that is something that we need. Also, Ambedkar and Gandhi, and I have already touched upon that. I do not want to underline an evolutionary trajectory in Ambedkar's thought. We also need to see how it was framed, and his ideas, were framed in particular historical context, and he changed his stance. That's why, as I mentioned, 1916, we see a very radical, pronouncement on sex and sexuality, gender, and caste. But when it comes to practicing these on grounds, there are many complications. All right.
So, Shailaja, we have like 2 raised hands. Maybe we could take
okay.
them.
Yeah.
Santana, go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you, Professor Paik, for this talk. It was a pleasure hearing you speak. And thank you for bringing this or unpacking this, Ambedkar generating a new Dalit modernity for the Dalit woman and how he reconstituted the Dalit women, and bringing in the concept of masculinity and the masculine tenacity, and how he has pushed this idea of taking these and creating the identity or forming the identities of the Dalit women. Now, I in terms of this, I feel that a lot of upper caste feminists have dealt with the idea of Brahmanical patriarchy and sexuality and all of this, and somehow there is this I don't know if I can say ignorance, or rather a fear of mixing this idea of masculinity, the idea of the sexuality of the upper caste woman. They've gone to that, but there is a limiting sort of a take on it, where they've probably just limited themselves to unpacking Brahmanical patriarchy, but not this idea of this framework that Ambedkar provides us, in terms of the modernity of the Dalit woman. So I was just wondering, or I would like to know your critique on the idea of why do you think that, this has been lacking in the amount of work that's been produced on caste and gender by the upper caste feminists. I mean, clearly it's been lacking within, the Dalit feminist discourse with Dalit women writing about this. So yeah, I would just like to know your sort of thought behind it.
You have to unmute yourself. You have to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry. Yes. Thanks, Nantwana. So this, once again, my entire scholarship is talking about these new directions and pushing against, conventional elite feminist frameworks, which have excluded, Dalit women's subjectivities and Dalit women as actors, and, understanding as to how Dalit women have experienced oppressions of caste and gender and sexuality. So that is one. And the second is, once again, I want to focus and point out as to how it is the vernacular sources that have really, helped me understand the actual, content and the context of these debates that took place. So paying attention to that helps me really lay out the experiences of Dalit women, which have been ignored by elite feminists. And that is why my construction of the Dalit humanist, womanist, or a masculine Dalit womanhood is very much rooted in the language that was used by Dalit women, men, including Ambedkar, who were trying to construct a new womanhood and a new Dalit political and a Dalit human in the early and the mid 20th century. So this is where I would like to rest my case. The object is not to show as to how there have been some frames of how women were, or how there was a fusion of masculinity and femininity, but for me that is actually coming from Marathi Dalit vernacular sources, which talk about as to how this masculinity is not necessarily becoming more manly, but talking about these Marathi concepts that could be that were looked upon as masculine. So this is my critique of elite feminist frameworks.
Okay, so we have two raised hands, Mohit Yadav and then Muganthan R.
Hello. Good evening, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes,
Yeah,
you are,
so-
Mohit. Please go ahead.
yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, ma'am, for giving me this opportunity. So, ma'am, my first, I am astonished to know that Ambedkar have worked on subject on the daily life, like how to dress, how to behave, and this thing. And my question is the Ambedkar's insight on Dalit women appearances and advice to dress like upper caste women. And so how was Dalit women react to it, and whether these ideas were part of modernizing Dalit women in homogeneity, modern, how to put it, uh, project of project of modernity as a homogeneous act, or there was some real issue, or and is relating to it, how many women could afford that way, to dress like upper women, both economically and in their daily life mental comfort. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Mohit. So once again, I would direct you to go to my pieces where I have dealt with these questions in depth. So I will quickly talk about it. This is not merely Sanskritization or modernization, but this change was important for Dalit dignity, for Dalit women to be considered human, to be considered women, and not merely Sanskritization. So it is not merely a homogenizing strategy. There are some deeper implications and deeper thought that Ambedkar, argued for. One was most important, and these processes, and this is a politics as to how Dalits would actually cut off from caste markers. Certainly not all Dalits did not have the economic means and resources to do this, but most of them they did try to even drape themselves in full clothing. So that is what was important for Dalits, to present themselves, to be able to talk to different publics, and to be considered human. I think that is the most important thing here.
Okay, thank you so much, sir. Ma'am, which part of you were talking, in which piece or in which article, I can find all these issues? Like,
Sure, you can go to my first book, Dalit Women's Education in Modern India. I have also reviewed S. Anandi's and Karin Kapadia's Dalit Women, Vanguard of an Improper or Alternative Politics. So you could also take a look at that. I also, written a very critical historiographical piece on new Dalit womanhood, which was published in History Compass. And that is, I have just analyzed the entire scholarship on Dalit womanhood. So, you'll find more details there also. Yeah. Papuri, I'll take a last question and then I have to hop off.
Yes. So Mugunthan R, if you want to ask your question, we can end with that. Are you there? Okay. If not, I think we can conclude. And apologies to, okay. Are you there, Mugunthan? You can ask your question. Yes. You have to unmute yourself. Mugunthan, yeah, you have to unmute yourself because we can't hear you. Not sure if you're speaking. Okay, maybe he's having issues with connectivity. So I think we can conclude with this, and apologies for those questions that we could not take up. Thank you so much, Shailaja, for this fantastic talk. There's a lot for us to, I think, absorb and think and read and reread. And we've been reading a lot of your work in our classes. So it's been amazing to hear you speak. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Papuri and Navneeta. Thanks to the Center of Women's Studies. And thank you all for joining us today. It was a wonderful session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Please join us for our other seminars as well.
And we'll share the recording on YouTube. Thanks.
Yes. Yeah, okay. All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.